There is a term that has become synonymous with Russian offensive tactics in this war. Ukrainian soldiers call it the meat assault, Myasny Sturm. It is exactly what it sounds like. Russian commanders, unable to achieve breakthroughs through tactical skill, technological superiority, or operational creativity, resort to the most primitive and most wasteful form of warfare imaginable. They send waves of infantry across open ground toward fortified positions, accepting catastrophic casualties in the hope that sheer numbers will eventually overwhelm the defenders, or that the defenders will run out of ammunition before the attackers run out of men. It is a doctrine born of desperation, sustained by a command culture that treats human life as an expendable resource no different from artillery shells or fuel, and executed by soldiers who, in many cases, have been given so little training that they cannot properly operate their weapons, cannot read a tactical map, cannot apply a tourniquet to a wounded comrade, and do not even understand the tactical situation they are being sent to die in. These are not the professional soldiers of Russia's pre-war military. Those men are largely dead, wounded, or broken after nearly 3 years of continuous combat. The men being sent forward now are mobilized civilians, factory workers, farmers, drivers, clerks, pulled from their homes and their families, given rifles and a few weeks of instruction that barely qualifies as training, and fed into the front line as replacements for the thousands who came before them and died in the same fields, attacking the same positions with the same futile tactics. Days ago, on one of the most brutal sectors of the Eastern Front, Russian forces launched 6 consecutive infantry assaults against a fortified Ukrainian position over a period of approximately 48 hours. Each wave was repelled. Each wave left bodies in the frozen fields. By the end of the second day, Ukrainian defenders estimated that between 280 and 320 Russian soldiers had been killed or wounded in the assaults. The Ukrainian line had not moved a single meter. The position they were defending, a network of trenches, bunkers, and firing positions that Ukrainian combat engineers had spent weeks constructing and fortifying, remained exactly where it had been before the first Russian soldier stepped into the open. This is the story of those 48 hours. It is not a story of heroic Russian charges or clever tactical maneuvers. It is a story of industrial-scale human waste, of young men sent to die in frozen fields by commanders who watched from bunkers kilometers behind the line. And it is a story of Ukrainian defenders who held their ground with discipline, skill, and a cold professionalism that turned every Russian assault into a massacre. The sector in question was a stretch of the front line where Russian forces had been attempting to advance for weeks. The terrain was typical of eastern Ukraine, flat or gently rolling agricultural land, broken by occasional tree lines, drainage ditches, and the ruins of farm buildings. The Ukrainian position sat on a slight elevation that gave defenders excellent fields of fire across 400 to 600 meters of open ground in every direction. The position had been reinforced with deep trenches, concrete-reinforced bunkers, multiple layers of razor wire, anti-personnel mines on the approaches, and pre-registered mortar and artillery fire points covering every likely avenue of attack. It was, in military terms, a textbook defensive strongpoint, the kind of position that any competent officer would recognize as suicidal to assault frontally without overwhelming fire support or armored vehicles. Russian command ordered the assault with neither. The first wave came at approximately 6:15 on the first morning. Ukrainian observation drones, maintaining continuous surveillance of the Russian positions approximately 800 meters away, detected movement in the Russian trench lines roughly 20 minutes before the attack. Soldiers were massing in forward trenches, checking weapons, receiving what appeared to be last-minute instructions from NCOs. Ukrainian drone operators counted between 40 and 50 soldiers preparing to advance. They relayed the information to the Ukrainian command post, which alerted all defensive positions, placed mortar teams on standby, and ordered FPV drone operators to prepare strike packages. At 6:15, the Russian soldiers climbed out of their trenches and began advancing across the open field toward the Ukrainian position. They moved in a loose formation, spread out to reduce the effect of individual explosions, but without any recognizable tactical structure. There were no armored vehicles supporting the advance. There was no smoke screen to obscure the approach. There was no suppressive fire from Russian positions to keep Ukrainian defenders' heads down. There was no artillery preparation of the objective. The Russian soldiers simply walked forward across open, frozen ground toward a fortified position defended by experienced Ukrainian troops who had been watching them prepare for 20 minutes. Ukrainian defenders opened fire at approximately 400 meters. Machine guns, positioned in bunkers with interlocking fields of fire that created overlapping kill zones across the entire approach, were the primary weapons. The sound was deafening and continuous. Tracer rounds cut across the frozen field in long, sweeping arcs. The effect on the advancing Russian soldiers was immediate and devastating. Men fell in the first seconds, some dropping instantly, others stumbling and collapsing after a few steps. The survivors hit the ground, pressing themselves into the frozen earth, seeking any depression, any fold in the terrain that might offer cover from the storm of fire. But the terrain was flat, open, and frozen solid. There was no cover. There was no escape. Ukrainian mortar teams, pre-registered on the exact ground the Russian soldiers were now lying on, began dropping rounds with lethal accuracy. The first mortar salvo landed among a cluster of soldiers who had taken cover in a shallow depression approximately 300 meters from the Ukrainian line. The explosion sent shrapnel scything across the frozen surface, hitting men who were already wounded and pinned down. A second mortar salvo targeted the rear of the advancing group where several soldiers were attempting to retreat. They were caught in the open, running back toward their own trenches across ground that was now swept by both machine gun fire and mortar fragments. Ukrainian FPV drones, launched the moment the advance began, descended on groups of Russian soldiers who had managed to find temporary cover behind low mounds of earth or in shallow ruts in the field. The drones carried fragmentation warheads that were devastating against exposed infantry. Each strike eliminated 1 to 3 soldiers and scattered the survivors, forcing them to move and exposing them again to machine gun fire. The first wave lasted approximately 25 minutes from the moment the Russian soldiers left their trenches to the moment the last survivors crawled back. Ukrainian defenders estimated between 12 and 18 Russian soldiers killed and another 15 to 20 wounded. Out of approximately 45 who had begun the advance, the field was littered with bodies and wounded men crying out in the freezing cold. Some of the wounded would lie in the open for hours before Russian medics could attempt to recover them. And several of those recovery attempts would themselves be targeted by Ukrainian drones. The second wave came 4 hours later, at approximately 10:30. This time, roughly 60 soldiers advanced, a larger force, suggesting that Russian command had reinforced the assault group. The tactics were identical. No armor, no smoke, no artillery preparation, no suppressive fire. The result was identical. Ukrainian machine guns, mortars, and drones cut the advance to pieces within 30 minutes. Estimated Russian losses: 20 to 25 killed, 25 to 30 wounded. The Ukrainian line did not move. The third wave came at 16 March the same day, approximately 50 soldiers. Same approach, same result. By now, the field between the Russian and Ukrainian positions was becoming an obstacle in itself. Bodies, discarded equipment, and wounded men littering the frozen ground, forcing the advancing soldiers to navigate around their fallen comrades. Ukrainian defenders reported that some of the Russian soldiers in the third wave appeared disoriented and reluctant, moving slowly, bunching together, stopping frequently as if uncertain whether to continue. Several turned back before reaching the engagement zone. Those who pressed forward were killed or wounded like the rest. Estimated losses: 15 to 20 killed, 20 to 25 wounded. The fourth wave came before dawn on the second day, approximately 04:30, suggesting that Russian command hoped darkness would provide concealment. It did not. Ukrainian thermal drones tracked every soldier from the moment they left their trenches, and the thermal optics on Ukrainian machine gun positions turned darkness into an advantage for the defenders rather than the attackers. The Russian soldiers, approximately 40 of them, were bright white targets on thermal screens, moving across a black landscape with no cover and no concealment. The slaughter was even more efficient in the dark. Estimated losses: 18 to 22 killed, 15 to 20 wounded, and at least 4 who surrendered by walking toward Ukrainian positions with their hands raised. Intercepted Russian communications between the 4th and 5th waves revealed the human reality behind the numbers. A Russian sergeant was recorded arguing with his company commander, his voice raw with emotion. He told the commander that his men refused to go forward again, that they had watched 3 waves of their comrades die in those fields, and they knew they would die too. The commander's response, captured clearly on the recording, was blunt. He told the sergeant that anyone who refused the order would be shot. The sergeant went silent. 20 minutes later, the 5th wave began forming. The 5th wave, approximately 70 soldiers, the largest yet, attacked at approximately 18 on the second morning. This time, Russian artillery provided limited support. A brief barrage of approximately 20 rounds that landed on the Ukrainian position before the infantry advance. The barrage caused minor damage to one trench section and wounded 2 Ukrainian soldiers, the only Ukrainian casualties in the entire 48-hour engagement. The artillery fire ceased the moment the Russian infantry began advancing, for fear of hitting their own troops. Ukrainian defenders, largely unaffected by the barrage, resumed their positions within seconds and met the advancing wave with the same disciplined, devastating fire. The 5th wave was the bloodiest. The larger number of soldiers meant more targets in the open simultaneously, and Ukrainian machine gunners, mortar crews, and drone operators engaged them with the efficiency of 2 days' practice on the same ground. Estimated Russian losses: 35 to 45 killed, 30 to 40 wounded. Bodies now lay across the field in such density that advancing soldiers in the rear of the formation stumbled over them. The 6th and final wave came at approximately 14 on the second day. It was smaller, roughly 35 soldiers, and it was the most revealing assault of all. The Russian soldiers advanced with visible reluctance. Their body language, captured on Ukrainian drone cameras, told the story of men who knew they were walking to their deaths and had been forced to do it anyway. Many stopped after less than 100 meters and refused to go further, dropping to the ground and lying motionless. Some dropped their weapons and pressed their faces into the frozen earth, waiting for the fire to stop. Others turned and ran back toward their own trenches, ignoring whatever threats their officers had made. A handful, in perhaps 10 or 12, pressed forward with something resembling determination, and they were killed within 200 meters of the Ukrainian position, cut down by machine gun fire that they had no ability to answer. Ukrainian drone operators reported that at least 5 Russian soldiers from the 6th wave deliberately walked toward Ukrainian positions with their hands raised above their heads, choosing captivity over the certain death of continuing the advance. They were taken prisoner by Ukrainian soldiers, who emerged briefly from their positions to receive them. One of the prisoners, a man in his 40s who had been mobilized from a factory in central Russia, collapsed to his knees in the Ukrainian trench and wept. After the 6th wave, no further assaults came. The Russian command, whoever was responsible for ordering these attacks, apparently concluded that the position could not be taken by frontal infantry assault, at least not without armored support or a fundamentally different approach. The silence that fell over the sector was broken only by the sounds of wounded Russian soldiers in the field, men calling out for help, for water, for their mothers, some of whom would lie in the freezing cold for more than 12 hours before Russian medics attempted nighttime recovery operations. Ukrainian forces did not fire on the medical recovery teams. The wounded were not their enemy. The men who sent them were. Analysis of Russian losses. Over 48 hours in 6 assault waves, Ukrainian defenders inflicted the following estimated casualties on Russian forces. Killed, 280, 320 soldiers. Wounded, 130, 160 soldiers. Captured approximately 15 soldiers who surrendered during or after assaults. Total Russian casualties: 425, 495 soldiers in a single 48-hour period at a single position on the front. The material cost of these losses is relatively low compared to armored engagements. Infantry carry personal weapons, ammunition, and basic equipment worth approximately $2,000, $5,000 per soldier. Total equipment losses: approximately $850,000, $2.5 million. But the human cost is what matters. These were not professional soldiers. Intercepted communications and prisoner interrogations revealed that the majority of the troops committed to these assaults were recently mobilized men, civilians pulled from their lives weeks or months earlier. given abbreviated training that in many cases lasted less than a month, issued weapons they barely knew how to maintain, and sent to the front to fill gaps in depleted units. Some had been in Ukraine for less than 2 weeks. Several captured soldiers could not accurately describe their unit designation or chain of command. One prisoner told Ukrainian interrogators that his training consisted of 2 weeks of basic rifle instruction and 3 days of what he described as combat orientation, which amounted to being told to follow the man in front of him and shoot at anything moving. Russia's command doctrine treats these men as expendable, units of ammunition to be fired at the enemy and replaced from the next mobilization wave. The officers who ordered these assaults were not on the field. They were in bunkers and command posts kilometers behind the line, watching drone feeds that showed their soldiers dying and ordering more to follow. The intercepted conversation between the sergeant and his commander, in which the commander threatened to shoot any soldier who refused to advance, encapsulates the moral bankruptcy of Russia's approach to this war. Strategic implications. The meat assault tactic is not new in this war. Russian forces have employed it with increasing frequency as their armored vehicle reserves dwindle and their ability to conduct combined arms operations degrades. Without enough tanks and IFVs to support infantry advances, Russian commanders fall back on the only resource they have in relative abundance: human bodies. But even this resource is not infinite. Since February 2022, Russia has lost approximately 149,000 soldiers killed and wounded. The mobilization waves that have fed the front line are drawing from an increasingly shallow pool. Russia's demographic crisis, a declining birth rate, an aging population, the emigration of hundreds of thousands of working-age men who fled the country to avoid mobilization, means that every wave of casualties hits harder than the last. The soldiers dying in frozen fields in eastern Ukraine are not surplus population. They are fathers, sons, skilled workers, potential contributors to a society that is bleeding its future into the soil of a country it has no right to occupy. Ukrainian forces, by contrast, demonstrated everything that meat assaults cannot achieve. Discipline, preparation, and the intelligent use of technology turned a fortified position into an impenetrable wall. Machine gunners maintain fire discipline, engaging at optimal ranges, conserving ammunition, shifting fire between targets with practiced efficiency. Mortar crews delivered accurate fire on pre-registered points without wasting a single round on empty ground. Drone operators prioritized targets and coordinated strikes with ground-based fire to maximize casualties and minimize Ukrainian ammunition expenditure. The entire defensive system worked as an integrated machine, each component multiplying the effectiveness of the others. And at the center of it all were Ukrainian soldiers who watched 6 waves of human beings walk into their guns and held their ground without flinching for 48 hours, through day and night, through the screams of the wounded and the silence of the dead, through the exhaustion of continuous combat and the psychological weight of killing men who never had a chance. These are soldiers hardened by nearly 3 years of continuous combat who understand that the men walking toward them are victims of a system that views them as disposable, but who also understand that allowing those men to reach the Ukrainian trenches means death for themselves and for their comrades. They do what they must. They do it with precision, and they do it again and again, wave after wave, because that is what defending their country demands. The broader picture is damning for Russia. Across the entire Eastern Front, meat assault tactics have become the default Russian approach, not because they work, but because Russian commanders have nothing else left. The armored vehicles that once supported infantry advances have been destroyed in their thousands by Ukrainian drones and anti-tank weapons. The experienced officers who once planned combined arms operations are dead or wounded. The Air Force that was supposed to provide close support has been degraded by Ukrainian air defenses, to the point where Russian pilots rarely risk flying within range of the front line. All that remains is bodies, and even that supply is not infinite. Every wave that Russian commanders launch against Ukrainian positions consumes soldiers who took months to mobilize, equip, transport, and position at the front. Every wave that fails, and they almost all fail, represents a net loss of Russian combat power that no amount of patriotic rhetoric can replenish. The mobilization system that feeds the front line is not an infinite machine. It draws from a population that is aging, shrinking, and increasingly unwilling to sacrifice its sons for a war that has achieved nothing but suffering and death. Russia sends its people to die. Ukraine sends them back in body bags, when Russia bothers to collect them. The fields of eastern Ukraine are filling with the bodies of men who were told this would be easy, who were told the Ukrainians were weak, who were told one more push would break the line. They were lied to by their commanders, betrayed by their government, and killed by Ukrainian defenders who will not yield a single centimeter of their homeland to an invader. No matter how many waves are sent, no matter how many bodies pile up in the frozen fields, Ukraine fights, Ukraine holds, Ukraine endures. This is Iron Front. The battlefield speaks louder than propaganda.